The late autumn night was biting. A freezing rain whipped through the city, slicing like countless tiny needles against everything it touched. I hadn't set foot on this soil for 3 years. 3 years on the front lines, surrounded by the haze of war and the whispers of death. I had grown accustomed to cold steel and the possibility that my heart might stop at any second. Through it all, the only thing that kept me anchored to sanity was the frayed, worn-out photograph of my daughter, Lily, tucked inside my vest. I pushed open the front door. I had expected a warm embrace, or at the very least, a single light left on for a returning soul. Instead, I was met with bone-chilling cold. The house was pitch black. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the scent of stagnation and a faint cloying perfume that didn't belong to Veronica.
Veronica? Lily?
My voice echoed through the vast, empty living room, met only by the hollow sound of my own breathing. A sudden, sharp premonition gripped my heart. I dropped my heavy gear bag, ignored the soaking tactical jacket I was wearing, and sprinted toward the main entrance.
If they weren't inside.
Where was Lily? As I threw the door open, a violent gust of wind surged into the foyer, extinguishing the hallway light. In that brief, chaotic moment, illuminated by the dim, cold glare of a distant street lamp, I saw it, a small white heap huddled in the corner of the porch, nearly submerged in the freezing runoff. My mind went blank, as if struck by a bullet.
Lily?
I scrambled into the rain. It was her, a small, fragile figure wearing a thin lace nightgown that should have been pink, now drenched and stained with mud. She was curled into a tiny ball, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. It was my Lily, my precious girl.
Lily? Daddy's here? Daddy's back!
My hands trembled violently as I scooped her up from the frigid concrete. The moment my skin touched hers, my heart nearly stopped.
She was as cold as ice.
Her soft brown hair was plastered to her forehead, and her tiny lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue.
She didn't cry.
She didn't even have the strength to open her eyes. Her breathing was so faint it was barely perceptible, a fragile thread holding her to life. I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry, baby.
Daddy's late. I pulled her tight against my chest, using the oversized tactical jacket to envelop her, desperate to shield her from the lethal cold with my own fading body heat. In that heartbeat, my fury, my grief, and the cold, calculated discipline of a soldier all fused into a river of molten lava in my chest.
Who? Who could abandon a 5-year-old child on a night like this, tossing her away like trash?
My gaze shifted to the villa behind me. I had purchased this house before I left, pouring every cent I had into creating a sanctuary for Veronica and Lily.
Back then, I was a man living in the shadows, a secret mogul who believed I was protecting my greatest treasure.
I had no idea I was sheltering a venomous snake under my roof. I stood up, holding Lily. My steps were heavy and deliberate, each one crushing the last remnants of my foolish, love-blinded past. Lily stirred weakly, sensing a familiar warmth. A soft, broken sob escaped her lips.
Mommy,
please don't leave Lily.
Lily will be good.
The words were like a jagged blade slicing through my heart. I bit down hard, tasting blood. I kept my expression blank, my eyes fixed on the dim light glowing from an upstairs window.
So that's it?
This was the truth behind her working late, her sacrifices for the family. I looked down at Lily's small, pale hands, marred by raw red scratches, evidence of her desperately clawing at the door, begging for mercy that never came. I took a deep, steadying breath, burying the homicidal rage deep down. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a father, and I swore, right there in the rain, that anyone who had hurt them would pay 10, 100 times over. The rain continued to pour, as if trying to wash away the sins of this city. I carried Lily toward that door, the gateway to betrayal.
it wasn't locked.
In this house, Veronica felt no need to lock out intruders, because she never imagined I would return from the dead. I kicked the door open. The thick carpet absorbed the rainwater with a dull thud. From upstairs, the sound of light laughter drifted down, accompanied by the clink of wine glasses, a sound so jarring in the gloom. Julian, stop it.
We have that contract to sign tomorrow.
What if that idiot comes back and sees...
It was Veronica's voice, sweet, melodic, and sickeningly fake. I stood in the shadows at the bottom of the staircase, my muscles coiled like a spring. Not just from the cold, but from an icy, lethal rage. Lily shifted in my arms, perhaps sensing the malice thick in the air. I patted her back gently, whispering into her hair. Don't be afraid, Lily. Daddy is home. From this moment on, no one will ever hurt you again. I looked up, my eyes hardened by years of war, locked onto the ajar door of the master bedroom. The show was about to begin. The rain still roared outside, but the warmth was slowly returning to Lily's skin. I didn't rush up immediately. I needed to be cold. I laid her down on the living room sofa and wrapped her in my dry inner liner. Watching her pale face, I felt a profound sense of solitude and a terrifying crystal-clear focus. For 3 years, I had isolated myself in the name of duty. I thought I was building a future for them, but all I had done was build a bed for their greed and a greenhouse for their betrayal. I walked to the liquor cabinet and grabbed one of Veronica's most expensive bottles. The cold glass felt like my heart. Upstairs, the laughter peaked, followed by a sickening, flirtatious gasp. "Tell me." Julian's voice drifted down, dripping with arrogance. "Is that pathetic soldier still overseas?"
I hope he stays there forever.
Don't worry about the property transfer. I've got the papers ready.
"Once you sign, the house, the accounts, the secret assets, it's all ours." My fingers tightened around the bottle until the glass groaned.
Secret assets.
So she hadn't just betrayed my heart. She had been digging into my foundations all along. A cold, mirthless smile touched my lips. "Veronica, you wanted my life, my money, and you were willing to discard our own daughter in a freezing storm to get it.
Very well.
I will show you how everything you pride yourself on turns to ash." I reached into my bag and pulled out a satellite phone. "Abort the original plan," I said, my voice low and authoritative.
Initiate the Falcon Protocol.
"Notify the board. I have new arrangements for tomorrow morning." The executive on the other end stammered in shock. "Boss, you're back?"
But execute the order.
I hung up and tossed the phone onto the sofa. I looked up at that flickering yellow light. It looked like a fragile, dying dream.
My eyes shifted back to Lily.
She was sleeping fitfully, her brow furrowed, her tiny hands clutching at the air. I reached out and took her hand.
Daddy's here, I whispered.
"Everything is over."
I began to climb the stairs.
Each step creaked, a rhythmic, ominous countdown for the pair behind that door. The rain would wash away many things tonight. My naivety, my mercy, and most certainly, your hollow, arrogant lives. I pushed the door open. The air froze. Veronica was straddling Julian, a wine glass in her hand. The smile on her face didn't have time to fade before it twisted into a mask of pure, primal terror.
You?
Veronica shrieked. The wine glass shattered against the floor, the sound sharp and piercing.
How?
How could you possibly be alive? I stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, water dripping from my hair onto the expensive rug. I looked at her as if she were already a corpse. "I'm home, my dear wife," I said, my voice as flat and calm as a winter morning. "But on my way I found our daughter, abandoned in the rain." Veronica's face went corpse white. She tried to scramble for an excuse, but it was too late.
It's not.
That was an accident.
"Lily," shut up. I stepped into the room, each footfall crushing her pride. "As of this moment, everything you possess is about to turn to dust." I didn't give them a chance to justify their sins. In my world, betrayal requires no explanation, only total destruction. The rain was just getting started, and for you two, the nightmare had only just begun. I stood at the bedroom door, rainwater dripping from my combat boots, pooling into dark stains on the pristine, high-end carpet. The room reeked of a cheap, cloying cologne, Julian's signature scent, clashing sickeningly with the delicate lily fragrance that Veronica had worn the day I left. The two of them froze. Julian's hand was still pressed against Veronica's waist, and her bare shoulders glowed pale in the ambient light. The eyes that had looked at me with such feigned devotion over video calls for 3 years were now wide with primal terror and disbelief. "You, how are you here?" Veronica's voice trembled. She scrambled to grab a silk robe, clutching it to her chest, desperate to hide the wreckage of her betrayal. I didn't answer. I just watched her. My silence was a weight that seemed to suffocate the room. She couldn't hold my gaze. She flickered a nervous glance at the wall clock. 2:10 a.m. Suddenly my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an incoming call from my dear wife. The vibration sounded like a mocking drumbeat in the heavy silence. I pulled the phone out, locked eyes with her, and tapped the speakerphone button right in front of them.
Hello, darling?
I spoke into the receiver, my voice as flat and still as a stagnant pool. On the other end, Veronica's face froze. She looked from the phone in my hand to my expressionless, icy face. Her breathing spiked.
Hello.
Honey.
Her voice came through, perfectly curated, laced with the exhaustion and grievance of a woman working overtime.
Why are you calling?
Aren't you overseas? Is everything all right?
Watching her play act, listening to her feigned fatigue while she stood there caught in the act was almost laughable in its absurdity. "Where I am doesn't matter," I said, stepping closer, every word precise. "I'm asking you, what are you doing right now?" On the other end, she fell into her rhythm, a lie she had clearly rehearsed 1,000 times. Oh, we just finished a major acquisition meeting. I'm still at the office, completely drained. I'll have to pull an all-nighter to finish the proposal.
Regarding Lily.
I've arranged for a sitter. Don't worry about her. Work is just so hectic. You don't blame me for being away, do you? At the office, a cruel sharp curve touched my lips.
Funny.
Your office seems to be located in our master bedroom. The silence on the other end was absolute. Veronica looked up, her face draining of color. The phone slipped from her shaking fingers, landing silently on the plush rug.
You lunatic.
Julian finally snapped out of his shock. He stood up, trying to project some semblance of authority to hide his cowardice. He was a typical opportunist, a man who built his life on strategic marriages and backroom deals. He pointed a finger at me, his voice shrill. How dare you break into a private residence? This is Veronica's home. You're nothing but a deadbeat soldier who disappeared for 3 years, and you think you can come back here with these petty, pathetic threats? I'll have the police arrest you before you can blink. I ignored him, stooping down to retrieve the phone. The call was still active. I could hear Veronica's ragged, panicked breathing on the other end.
Julian, stop.
Veronica seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. She looked at me, a flicker of vicious intent crossing her eyes. Since you're so busy, I won't disturb your meeting anymore, I said into the phone.
Carry on.
I truly hope that contract is worth it. I hung up and tossed the phone onto the heap of discarded clothes.
What do you want?
Veronica stood her ground, trying to reclaim her persona as a power woman, despite her face being as white as a sheet. If this is about me neglecting Lily, I can explain. It's all for our future.
Do you think your measly soldier's salary could ever afford a life like this?
It's my hard work keeping this family afloat. Her logic was crisp, delivered with that infuriating sense of self-righteousness. That was what sickened me most.
For our future?
I let out a dry, chilling laugh and took a step forward, forcing her back. Is your future throwing our daughter out into a freezing rainstorm so you could broker a dirty deal with your lover? It was an accident. The sitter enough. I was done with the excuses. I turned to leave. Seeing me move, Julian regained a sliver of false bravado. He lunged forward, trying to shove my shoulder.
Stay right there.
We are rent finished.
You think you're still the golden boy of 3 years ago?
You're a nobody. This house, this company, they aren't yours anymore. That shove was filled with arrogance. On the front lines, anyone who touched me like that wouldn't be breathing. I simply sidestepped, caught his wrist in a fluid motion and twisted. There was a sickening crack, followed by a high-pitched scream as Julian slammed into the wall, collapsing.
My hand.
My hand.
Veronica, call security.
Call them now.
Veronica shrieked, backing into the corner, paralyzed by the sudden violence. I let go of Julian. He curled into a ball on the floor, clutching his mangled wrist, whimpering. I looked down at him as if he were an insect beneath my heel. Consider that a welcome home gift, I said calmly. I told you, I'm going to teach you the true meaning of losing everything. I didn't look back. I walked out of the bedroom. Downstairs, I walked into the living room. Lily was still curled on the sofa, her face pale but her breathing more rhythmic. I picked her up, her fragile light frame sending a fresh jolt of pain through my heart. Daddy. She mumbled in her sleep, her tiny hand clutching my collar in a reflex of trust. It's okay, Lily. Daddy's taking you home. I carried her out the front door. The rain had softened and the air smelled of damp earth, as if the storm had washed away the grime of the last few years. I didn't care about what that pair would do next. I knew that by tomorrow they would be drowning in a depth of despair far greater than tonight. Back in the car, I secured Lily in the back seat. I started the engine, staring at the mansion that had once been my sanctuary. It stood silent and ominous in the dark. Veronica, you thought you were clever. You stole my money, manipulated my status, and tried to erase my existence. But you forgot one thing. There are some people in this world who are never to be trifled with.
You just crossed that line?
I pressed the gas and the car sped through the empty streets. My phone buzzed incessantly, dozens of texts from Veronica, threats, wails of victimhood, and desperate, final attempts at negotiation. I glanced at the screen, powered the phone down, and tossed it into the passenger seat. Daddy. Where are we going? Lily stirred in the back, her eyes heavy with sleep. I looked at her through the rearview mirror and offered her the most genuine, tender smile I had worn in years. To a place that truly belongs to us. The night was deep, and the streetlights ahead stretched my shadow long into the dark. I was no longer the soldier fighting for honor on a distant front. I was Lily's father. And to those who tried to trample on what I love, are you ready for the long night ahead? I sat in the silence, mentally tallying the surprises I had prepared for them tomorrow. Each one would dismantle them, every detail would be a footnote in the final chapter of their lives. I didn't need revenge. Revenge is for the small-minded.
What I needed was deprivation.
I would strip them of their status, their wealth, and every crutch they relied on in this city. I would watch them flounder in the mud, watch them tear each other apart, and finally watch them crumble into the destruction they had earned. This is the price of your expensive lies. The house was not just a structure of glass and steel. It was a monument to the 3 years of blood, sweat, and silence I had endured for the sake of the people inside. Now, as I stood in the master bedroom, the air felt toxic. The opulence, the imported silk linens, the designer furniture, the ambient mood lighting had been repurposed into a stage for a farce, a cheap production of infidelity and greed. Veronica sat frozen on the edge of our bed, her eyes darting between me and Julian like a cornered animal. Julian, clutching his broken wrist, had scrambled into the corner, his face a mask of sweat and agonizing humiliation. The silence was absolute save for the rhythmic, muffled ticking of the wall clock, a countdown that felt increasingly loud.
You think you can just walk in here?
Julian hissed, his voice cracking from the pain. He tried to reclaim some shred of his waning authority, but his eyes betrayed him. They were darting toward the door, calculating his escape.
This isn't your house anymore.
Your name isn't even on the deed.
Veronica has been the sole owner for months.
You're a trespasser.
I looked at him, this man who thought he had outmaneuvered me. He was a corporate bottom feeder who thrived on the scraps of others. He didn't know that the deed he spoke of was a legal labyrinth I had designed myself. I let out a sharp, cold chuckle that echoed against the vaulted ceiling.
A trespasser?
I moved toward him, my presence alone causing him to shrink against the cold wall. You don't understand the first thing about ownership? You think a signature on a piece of paper makes you the master? You are nothing but a squatter in a palace you don't even know how to govern. I turned my gaze to Veronica. She had pulled the robe tight, but her composure was shattered. The CEO veneer, the ice-cold exterior she used to intimidate subordinates, had evaporated, leaving behind someone small, desperate, and pathologically selfish. Tell me, Veronica, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low register.
When you decided to invite Julian into our bed, into the room where I used to watch you sleep, did you ever stop to think about Lily?
Or was she just a liability to be left in the rain so you could have a quiet night to divide the spoils? Veronica's jaw tightened. She stood up, trying to regain her footing.
You don't know the pressure I've been under.
You've been gone for 3 years?
You were a ghost. I had to build a life, a company, a reputation. Julian was there. He offered me support, capital, and a future. You offered me nothing but silence and uncertainty. The audacity of her victimhood was almost impressive. She wasn't just apologizing, she was rationalizing.
She truly believed her betrayal was a logical business decision.
Support.
I stepped toward her, and she retreated until her back hit the vanity mirror. I looked at our reflections. The contrast was stark. I looked like a man who had returned from the grave, while she looked like a woman who had sold her soul for a comfortable chair.
Is that what you call it?
Is that why you systematically siphoned my accounts into your new company? Is that why you forged my signature on the asset transfers? Her eyes widened. She hadn't realized I knew that much.
How?
She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't spend 3 years in the hell of the front lines by being oblivious, Veronica. I turned my back on her, walking toward the window that overlooked the driveway. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world glistening and cold. Everything you've built, the company, the prestige, the billion-dollar deal, you're so proud of, it's built on a foundation of sand. And I am the tide. I heard a movement behind me. Julian, emboldened by my back being turned, lunged forward with a heavy brass lamp he had snatched from the nightstand. It was a desperate, amateurish move. I didn't even look back. I simply pivoted, catching his arm mid-swing with a precise, crushing grip. He let out a yelp of agony as the lamp shattered on the floor. I drove my forearm into his chest, pinning him against the edge of the bed with such force that the mattress frame groaned in protest. This is the difference between us, Julian, I said, my face inches from his. You fight for a paycheck and a seat at a table that doesn't belong to you. I fight for the people I love. You never stood a chance. I released him and he collapsed, sobbing and gasping for air. Veronica rushed over, not to help him, but to plead with me. She grabbed my arm, her touch repulsive. Please.
We can talk about this.
The deal, it's huge. It can make us both incredibly wealthy.
Just leave the company name as is, and we can cut you. We don't have to ruin everything.
I looked down at her hand, then slowly peeled her fingers off my sleeve.
You still don't get it, I whispered, my voice thick with disdain.
You think I want your money?
You think I care about the billion-dollar deal you're so desperate to close?
I walked to the bedroom door, stopping to look back at the room, the site of my betrayal and the altar of their greed.
I came here to collect my daughter, I said, my voice ice cold.
But now that I've seen the rot, I've decided to collect something else. I'm going to take everything from you. Not because I need it, but because you need to see exactly what you've sacrificed for nothing.
You can't.
Veronica screamed, her voice cracking.
You have no power.
The board will never side with a disgraced soldier over me. I paused at the threshold, a final chilling smile playing on my lips.
The board doesn't work for you, Veronica.
They work for the holding company.
And that holding company?
It's been mine since the day I bought it.
I closed the door, the latch clicking with a finality that felt like a guillotine. Downstairs, the house was quiet. I found Lily on the couch, wrapped in my jacket. She was finally sleeping, her face peaceful. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. The storm outside had passed, but the one I was bringing to their doorstep was only just beginning. I picked her up, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective resolve. I didn't need to stay in this house a second longer. It was just an empty shell now, housing two parasites who were about to realize that their reign was over. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single three-word text to my executive team: begin the collapse. The engine of my car roared to life, a low, predatory growl in the quiet suburban street. As I drove away, I didn't look back at the master bedroom window. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they were doing, staring at the empty room, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that they were no longer the predators, but the prey. The betrayal had been revealed. Now, the reckoning would begin. The next morning, the sunlight that filtered into the living room felt intrusive. It was a bright, sterile light that exposed the dust motes dancing in the air of a house that felt increasingly like a tomb. I had stayed the night on the living room sofa, my senses alert, listening to the muffled, frantic pacing from the floor above. Veronica and Julian weren't sleeping. They were plotting. By mid-morning, the front door swung open with a theatrical flourish. I didn't look up from the small book I was reading to Lily. She was sitting on my lap, her health slowly returning, though she remained unnervingly quiet, her eyes tracking the movements of the two intruders as they descended the stairs. Julian had his arm in a makeshift sling, his face pale and twisted with a mixture of pain and impotent rage. Behind him, Veronica looked composed, though her eyes were bloodshot. She had donned her most expensive suit, a suit of armor for a war she thought she had already won.
You're still here.
Veronica said, her voice dripping with a practiced icy disdain. She walked into the center of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. I expected you to have run off into the night like the coward you are. I finally looked up, closing the book. My eyes were calm, devoid of the volatile rage I had felt the night before. That had been replaced by something far more dangerous: cold, detached observation.
This is my home, Veronica, I replied evenly.
Why would I leave? Julian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. He stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who thought he held all the cards.
Your home?
You're delusional. You've been gone for 3 years?
You're a ghost, a disgraced soldier with no rank, no standing, and no assets. Look at yourself, you're wearing clothes that haven't been in fashion since before you left. You have no status, no leverage, and frankly, no place in this house. He gestured grandly to the walls, the art, the high ceilings. Veronica holds the deed. We hold the keys. We've already called the authorities.
Security will be here in minutes to escort you and that brat out of here.
Lily clutched my shirt, burying her face in my chest. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I stood up, placing a protective hand on Lily's head.
Security.
I asked, a faint mocking smile playing on my lips. Are you sure you want to involve outsiders in a private family matter?
It might be.
Embarrassing for you. Veronica stepped closer, her expression hardening. Embarrassing? The only thing embarrassing is you, standing there in my living room acting like you own the place. Do you have any idea how much money we have tied up in this property? Do you know what the board thinks of you?
They think you're a liability.
An erratic, unstable veteran who couldn't handle the realities of the corporate world. She stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You're nothing, and you have nothing. I've spent the last 3 years building a life you couldn't even fathom.
Julian and I have merged our assets.
We have the influence, the connections, and the legal standing.
You're just a squatter.
Get out, before I have you dragged out in handcuffs.
You want me to leave?
I asked, my voice steady. You want to evict me from this house? I'm evicting you, Julian corrected, his voice rising in volume. Pack your bags, take your daughter, and get lost. And don't even think about coming back. If you try to challenge the ownership, we'll bury you in legal fees until you're back on the streets where you belong. I looked at them, the two of them, so full of their own manufactured importance. They were like children playing with matches in a room full of gasoline.
Very well, I said, my tone surprisingly mild.
If you want me out, I'll go. But remember this, Veronica, you've spent so much time looking at the walls of this house that you've forgotten who built them. I picked up the small, worn travel bag I had brought with me. I didn't bother with the other belongings in the house. They were just things, and I had no attachment to them.
Come, Lily, I whispered, lifting her into my arms.
As we walked toward the door, Veronica called out, her voice filled with a hollow, vindictive joy. Don't bother looking back. You're a loser, just like you always were. Julian added, make sure you don't trip on your way out.
And don't worry about your reputation. Well, make sure everyone knows exactly why you were thrown out.
I didn't stop.
I didn't turn around.
I walked out into the bright morning air, feeling the weight of the house fall away from my shoulders. It was a beautiful, liberating sensation. The security guards were already pulling up to the curb as I stepped off the porch. They looked at me, then at the house, looking confused. They were local private security, hired by Veronica, and they didn't know who I was. I stopped in front of them, looking the lead guard in the eye. She's inside, I said, pointing toward the villa. She's expecting you to remove a trespasser. I walked past them and toward my car. Lily peeked over my shoulder at the house, her eyes wide. Are we going to be okay, Daddy?
Better than okay, Lily.
I whispered, opening the door for her.
We're going to be free.
As I pulled away, I glanced at the house one last time. Julian was standing on the porch, shouting at the security guards, waving his good arm, still playing the role of the master of the house. He had no idea that the bank, the utilities, and the very foundation of the company they were currently bankrupting were all tied to accounts I controlled. He thought he was evicting me. In reality, he was simply stepping into the trap I had set for him.
The drive was quiet.
I navigated through the city, heading toward a part of town they never visited. I wasn't going to a hotel. I was heading to a different property, one that was truly mine, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. As I drove, my phone chimed. It was a notification from my executive assistant.
The holdings are liquidated.
The internal audit has been initiated. The board of directors is waiting for your signal.
I didn't smile.
I didn't feel triumph. I only felt a cold clinical sense of closure. Veronica and Julian were currently celebrating their victory. They were likely pouring champagne, mocking me, and feeling secure in their stolen castle. They thought they had won the battle. They didn't realize they had just walked into the center of the battlefield, and the artillery was already zeroed in.
Daddy?
Lily asked, her voice small. Where are we going? To get everything back, I replied, my gaze fixed on the road ahead.
Everything they stole and much, much more.
The eviction wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the end. And for Veronica and Julian, the true price of their greed was about to be paid in full. The new location was a stark contrast to the hollow opulence of the villa. It was a high-security bunker-style office suite located in the heart of the city's financial district, a place where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the hum of high-end servers. Here, behind reinforced glass and biometric locks, was the engine room of my life's work. I placed Lily in a plush, ergonomic chair in the corner of the executive lounge, handing her a digital drawing tablet to keep her occupied. She looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. The only reason I was still tethered to this world. I gave her a reassuring nod before stepping into the central command pod. The room darkened, and a holographic interface flared to life. Connection established, the AI interface chimed, its voice cool and synthetic.
Encrypted channel open.
Connecting to the Global Executive Council. One by one, the faces of my senior directors materialized in the air, men and women who managed the intricate tapestry of my holdings across the globe. They were the most powerful people in their respective industries, yet they all bowed their heads when I appeared.
Welcome back, sir. The lead director, a man named Sterling, said, his voice laced with uncharacteristic emotion.
We have been waiting for the signal since you went dark 3 years ago. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Status report on the Blackwood acquisition. Sterling tapped a key, and a complex flow of data began to cascade across the holographic display. The billion-dollar deal that Veronica and Julian believed was their ticket to permanent elite status.
The deal is structurally sound on the surface, Sterling explained.
We have allowed Veronica and her partner Julian to believe they are the ones driving the integration. They have leveraged their personal assets, the villa, and every credit line they could access to secure their position as lead stakeholders.
They are completely over-leveraged.
I watched the red lines pulsing on the screen, the debt-to-equity ratios, the hidden clauses, the trapdoors I had built into the foundation of the deal months before my departure. And the final integration phase, scheduled for tomorrow's gala, another director, Maria, chimed. They are anticipating a ceremonial signing that will finalize the merger of their shell company with our holding subsidiary.
They believe they are acquiring a crown jewel.
In reality, they are signing a document that merges our liabilities, all of them, into their personal names. I allowed a cold, thin smile to touch my lips. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering.
They think they are taking everything from me.
They don't realize they are actually signing their own financial death warrants. There is one complication, sir, Sterling warned. Veronica has been soliciting Sideweed's local syndicates to ensure her liquidity during the transition. She's playing dirty, and she's already compromised several of our local vendors. Let her, I said, my voice cutting through the air. The more bridges she burns, the fewer exits she'll have when the house falls. I want the total control mechanisms primed. I don't just want the deal to fail. I want them to be personally liable for every cent of the debt. I want them to look into the eyes of every creditor and know that they are the ones who destroyed their own empire.
Understood, Sterling replied, bowing his head.
We have prepared the kill switch.
With one command, the entire digital infrastructure of their firm will lock down. The records of their embezzlement, their secret side days, and their forged signatures. It will all be made public simultaneously with the voiding of the contract.
Make sure the legal team is ready, I commanded.
I want the lawsuits ready to be served the second the gala ends.
I want them barred from leaving the city before they have been stripped of every last asset.
Sir, a question, Maria asked, her voice hesitant. Is there a chance they will attempt to flee? I thought back to the look on Julian's face as he threw me out of my own home, his arrogance and his desperate need to be the master. I thought of Veronica's cold, calculated betrayal, her willingness to sacrifice our daughter for a seat at a table that was never hers to begin with.
They won't run, I said, the conviction in my voice absolute.
They are too addicted to the prestige. They want to be seen as the winners. They will show up at that gala. They will stand on that stage and they will wait for the applause.
That is exactly where I want them.
I stood before the display, a silhouette against the shifting light of the data streams. This was the true nature of the power I had cultivated, not the brute strength of the battlefield, but the absolute control of the board. One final thing, I added, looking at the team. When the time comes to reveal the true ownership of the firm, I want you to make it clear that the mogul never left. I want them to see my signature on every document. I want them to know that every success they thought they had was merely an illusion I allowed them to experience.
It will be done, sir.
Good.
Begin the phase 2 synchronization.
The billion-dollar deal will proceed exactly as they planned until the very last second.
Don't let them suspect a thing. The holographic images vanished, leaving me alone in the dim light of the command center. The silence returned, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the villa. It was the silence of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. I walked over to the corner where Lily sat. She had stopped drawing and was looking at me with her head tilted, her small hands resting on the tablet.
Are we going to be rich again, Daddy?
She asked, her voice innocent and devoid of the complexities of the world. I knelt down, brushing the hair from her eyes.
Lily, we were always rich.
Some people just don't know the difference between wealth and value. Tomorrow, we're just going to take back what's ours so that you can grow up in a world where you don't have to worry about anything ever again. She smiled, a simple, pure gesture that made the coldness in my chest thaw for a brief moment. She didn't understand the board meetings, the legal traps, or the impending ruin of the two people who had abandoned her. She only knew that her father was back, and that he was stronger than the storm. I stood up, turning back to the panoramic window that overlooked the sleeping city. I could see the lights of the corporate tower where the gala would be held tomorrow. It looked like a monolith, a monument to greed that was about to be leveled. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. I had endured the mud, the cold and the isolation, all to become the architect of this specific destruction. The hidden mogul hadn't just returned, he had arrived to close the account. Every move, every interaction, and every word I had spoken to Veronica and Julian in the last 24 hours had been part of a carefully calibrated script. They were dancing to a beat they couldn't even hear, and the music was about to stop. The billion-dollar deal was no longer a business arrangement. It was the mechanism of their downfall. And when the sun rose on the day of the gala, they would wake up to the last day of their lives as they knew them. I turned off the main terminal, the room plunging into darkness. Outside, the city shimmered, indifferent to the lives that were about to be shattered.
I didn't care about the city.
I only cared about the small girl behind me, and the future I was about to reclaim for her. The plan was perfect. The assets were locked.
The trap was set.
Now, all that was left was to watch the chaos unfold. The grand ballroom of the Zenith Plaza was an ocean of gold leaf. crystal chandeliers, and the suffocating perfume of success. It was the epicenter of the city's elite, a place where fortunes were built on whispers and destroyed by a single nervous glance. Tonight, it was the stage for the signing of the billion-dollar deal, the moment Veronica and Julian had been salivating over for months.
They wanted a spectacle.
They wanted to cement their status as the new power brokers of the industry. And they would get their spectacle, just not the one they had choreographed. I walked through the towering mahogany doors, the sound of my boots muffled by the plush royal blue carpet. I wasn't wearing a tuxedo. I was in a simple, charcoal gray tactical cut suit, clean but devoid of the flamboyant silk ties and gold-plated cufflinks that seemed to be the uniform of the room. I held no invitation and I carried no wine. The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It didn't happen all at once, but rather like a ripple in a stagnant pond. Heads turned. Conversations previously buzzing with the hollow arrogance of the wealthy began to stutter and die. Who invited him? Someone whispered nearby, a man in a tuxedo so tight, it looked like it was cutting off the oxygen to his brain. That's him, another replied, pointing a manicured finger. The ex-husband. The one who just came back from the service. Heard Hez living in a motel somewhere on the outskirts. The laughter followed quickly, thin and brittle. It was the laughter of people who needed to mock others to feel taller. I ignored them, my gaze fixed on the elevated stage at the far end of the ballroom. There, standing under the spotlight, were Veronica and Julian.
They looked like royalty.
Veronica was draped in a floor-length gown that shimmered like liquid silver, and Julian, his arm in a sleek, customized sling that matched his tuxedo, looked every bit the triumphant conqueror. They were sipping champagne, their faces lit with the self-satisfied glow of people who believed they had cheated destiny.
Look at him.
Julian's voice boomed over the room's sound system as he spotted me. He didn't even try to hide his disdain. He wanted the room to see how he could crush the nobody in front of everyone. I thought security was instructed to keep the trash out of the ballroom tonight. The crowd erupted in a roar of sycophantic laughter.
Julian, darling, don't be so harsh, Veronica purred, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy.
She stepped to the microphone, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, triumphant malice. Hez probably just lost. It's hard to adjust to civilian life after 3 years of playing soldier, isn't it? Hez likely never seen this much money in one place. Let him stay for a moment. It's good for him to see what Hez lost. She gestured to the crowd, inviting them to join in. This is the reality of the business world, isn't it, everyone? Success favors the bold and the capable, not the ones who leave their families behind, only to crawl back when their pockets are empty. The room was filled with mocking glares. A few guests near me shifted away, as if my lack of status were contagious. A waiter brushed past me, deliberately stumbling and splashing a drop of water onto my sleeve.
Oops.
The waiter sneered, not even bothering to apologize. Careful, sir.
You're staining the atmosphere.
I stood perfectly still.
I didn't reach for my tie, I didn't offer a comeback, and I didn't look at the waiter.
I simply took a breath, the air in the room tasting like greed and impending disaster.
You look pathetic, Julian continued, stepping off the stage and walking toward me, surrounded by his entourage of cronies.
He was emboldened, drunk on the power of the moment. You come here in those rags expecting what?
An apology? A handout?
You were evicted for a reason.
You were a burden to Veronica's ambitions, and you're a stain on this event. He stopped inches from me, his breath smelling of expensive cognac. He reached out and tugged at the lapel of my jacket, his face twisted in a sneer. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It costs more than you made in your entire 3-year tour of duty. Get out, before I have you dragged out and thrown into the fountain in the plaza. The crowd circled us, phones held up, waiting for the humiliating climax. They wanted a scene. They wanted to see the disgraced soldier break, to see him grovel or lash out in a fit of impotent rage. I looked at Julian at his arrogant smirk, his pampered hands, his shallow, terrified eyes. I looked past him to Veronica, who was watching with the predatory glee of a queen witnessing an execution. I realized then that they weren't just evil. They were profoundly, tragically small. They were playing a game of marbles while I was holding the nuclear codes to their entire existence.
You're right, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a blade.
The ballroom went silent. The unexpected calm of my voice caught them off guard. This suit isn't worth much, I continued, looking down at my sleeve. And you're right about the money.
I haven't been thinking about money at all.
Oh?
Julian scoffed, his face flushing red.
Then, what have you been thinking about, soldier?
How to find a new job that doesn't involve manual labor?
I've been thinking about structure, I said, stepping past him toward the stage.
How easily a structure collapses when the foundation is rotten. You've built quite a castle tonight, Julian. It's beautiful, it's shiny, it's expensive. I stopped at the foot of the stage looking up at them. But tell me, do you know what happens when you start a fire in a building made of glass? Veronica frowned, a flicker of genuine unease crossing her face.
What are you talking about?
Security.
Get him out of here.
No, I said, holding up a hand.
The commanding tone in my voice made the security guards, who had been moving toward me, instinctively freeze in their tracks. It wasn't a request. It was an order honed by years of battlefield command. I'm not leaving. In fact, I'm the main attraction tonight. I reached into my inner pocket. The entire ballroom held its breath, expecting a weapon. Instead, I pulled out a single, thin, black tablet. Julian, you said earlier that you were the lead stakeholder in this deal. I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. And Veronica, you mentioned that you were the ones who built this empire from nothing. I tapped the screen. The massive holographic screens behind them, which had been displaying the company logo, suddenly flickered and shifted. Let's show the guests, I said, my voice chillingly soft, who really owns this company. The images on the screen, wiped away, replaced by a live scrolling ledger. Every transfer, every offshore shell account, every forged signature, and every secret contract they had signed in the last 72 hours. The ballroom erupted into a confused murmur. The names of the accounts were familiar to many of them, the very syndicates and firms they were currently doing business with. What is this? Julian stammered, his face draining of color.
This
is a hack. Stop it. It's not a hack, Julian, I said, walking up the stage stairs as the room watched in stunned silence. It's an audit, and you're about to find out exactly what happens when you try to sell a house that doesn't belong to you. Veronica clutched her dress, her poise shattered. She looked at the screens, then at me, her eyes finally filling with the realization of what I had done.
You, she whispered, her voice trembling.
You were the one.
I didn't come here to be mocked, I said, standing on the stage, dwarfing them both in the cold light of the screens. I came here to collect. I turned to the audience, the elite, the powerful, the mocking guests who were now staring at their own potential financial ruin, reflected in the data behind me.
Good evening, I said, my voice steady, powerful, and utterly devoid of mercy.
Welcome to the end of the deal.
The laughter was gone. The sneers had vanished. There was only the sound of 1,000 people realizing that the world they knew had just ended. And standing there, I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a promise kept. The performance was over. The destruction had begun. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a pressurized chamber waiting for the spark. On the massive screens behind me, the scrolling ledgers, the evidence of their embezzlement, the proof of the forged signatures, and the record of their desperate illegal side deals continued to cascade. The room was no longer filled with the elite. It was filled with witnesses. Julian, his face a mottled mask of crimson rage and sheer terror, didn't look at the screen.
He couldn't.
He looked at me, his eyes wide, frantically searching for some way to regain control. His ego was a fragile glass structure, and he could hear it fracturing. Turn it off. He shrieked at the sound technicians, his voice cracking.
Someone kill the feed.
Haze using a deepfake, a cyber attack.
None of this is real.
He lunged for the microphone, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He didn't care about the gala anymore. He didn't care about the deal. He only cared about silencing the truth. As he pushed past me, his shoulder slammed into mine, but I didn't budge. I stood like a monolith, anchored in the certainty of the endgame.
The truth isn't a hack, Julian, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the PA system.
It's a reality you've been living in, just too arrogant to acknowledge. He ignored me, his gaze locked on the audience, desperate to regain their favor. He grabbed a full crystal goblet of vintage Bordeaux from a passing waiter's tray. It was a reflex, a childish, visceral reaction, a way to exert dominance when words had failed him. You want to ruin my night? He hissed, his eyes darting back to me.
You want to play the martyr in your cheap suit?
With a sudden violent motion, he hurled the contents of the glass directly into my chest. The deep red wine splattered across my gray jacket, soaking through the fabric, staining my shirt like a spreading bloodstain. The smell of expensive, aged grapes filled the air. The ballroom gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a vacuum. Julian stood there, panting, a manic grin spreading across his face. Head done it. Head humiliated me. Head made me look like a common brawler, a spectacle, a mess.
Look at you,
he bellowed, his voice regaining its practiced, toxic arrogance.
Look at the state of you.
You're not a mogul. You're not a player. You're a beggar in a wine-soaked rag.
Get out of here.
This is a gala for people of status, not for gutter trowels like you. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide, pleading for their validation. Does anyone here really want to listen to a man who can't even dress for dinner?
Security.
Throw him out. Drag him if you have to. Veronica, standing to the side, let out a sharp, brittle laugh. She saw the opening. She saw the way the crowd had recoiled from the stain on my clothes. She stepped up, her eyes gleaming with practiced cruelty. It's truly pathetic, she added, her voice smooth and cold.
You come here, trying to stir up trouble, trying to peddle these ridiculous lies, and all you succeed in doing is making a scene.
You are exactly the man I remember. Impulsive, unstable, and utterly beneath us. Julian is right.
You don't belong here.
You never did.
The security guards, the same ones I had spoken to earlier that morning, began to move in. Their faces were impassive, but there was a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. They knew the truth, but they were still under contract. I stood there, the wine dripping from my hem onto the pristine ballroom floor. It was a sticky, slow process. I looked down at the stain, then up at Julian, who was trembling with the exertion of his own adrenaline. I didn't move.
I didn't reach for a napkin.
You think this is humiliation, Julian?
I asked. My voice was chillingly calm. The laughter in the room began to die down again, replaced by an uncomfortable prickling tension. There was something in my eyes, something they hadn't seen in the boardrooms or the country clubs that stopped them in their tracks. It was the look of a man who had seen men die for far less than a glass of spilled wine. You've spent your entire career confusing status with character. I continued, taking a step toward him. He flinched, instinctively retreating, his heel catching on the edge of the stage. You think that because you have a suit, a bottle of wine, and a room full of people who are too afraid to tell you the truth, that you have power. But power isn't granted by a tuxedo, Julian. It's earned through the cold, hard reality of consequence. I walked toward him. He backed up, the arrogant sneer vanishing from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated fear. He bumped into Veronica, who stumbled, her silver gown snagging on the stage equipment.
You stained my suit, I said, stopping inches from him.
That suit was the last thing I cared about in this house. I looked over at the crowd, at the men and women who had whispered about my lack of status, who had turned their backs when the stain was on my lapel. You all want to know who is the true owner? I addressed the room. My hand went to my inner pocket again. I pulled out a small metallic device, a master key fob for the building's security and server systems. Veronica, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the entire room.
Do you remember the $1 billion deal you signed this morning?
The one that was supposed to merge your shell companies into the holding subsidiary? Veronica's face turned the color of ash. She had begun to hyperventilate. The contracts are executed. I continued. But there was a clause you didn't read. The one on page 42, section 8. The one that states all liability and debt, including the outstanding loans from the syndicates you've been dealing with, transfer to the primary stakeholder.
I tapped the screen on the stage.
The ledger changed. The names Veronica and Julian were now highlighted in bold, under the section marked sole personal liability. You aren't the owners of this company, I said, a grim smile touching my lips. You are the primary debtors, and as of 60 seconds ago, those loans have been called in. The ballroom went deathly quiet. A phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the silence. Then another, then a chorus of them. Across the room, guests began checking their own devices, their faces twisting from confusion to realization to absolute horror.
The market is moving, I said, gesturing to the screens.
The stock is plummeting.
And you too?
You don't have a penny left to your names. You don't even have a home. The bank has already initiated the foreclosure on the villa. Julian's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the stage, the wine glass he had used to throw the wine shattering beneath his hand. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken. Veronica reached out, grabbing my sleeve, the sleeve that was still wet with the Bordeaux.
You can't.
She whimpered, the mask of the CEO finally, irrevocably torn away. Please.
You can't do this to me.
We have a future. We have. I leaned down, my face close to hers, my voice a cold promise.
You had a future, Veronica, I said.
Then you threw it out in the rain. I pulled my arm away. I didn't look at them again. I walked off the stage, my heavy boots echoing on the polished floor. The security guards didn't move to stop me. They stood aside, their heads bowed, as I walked toward the doors. Behind me, the ballroom descended into chaos. The elite were screaming, grabbing their bags, trying to distance themselves from the collapse. The red wine humiliation had been the final act, not of my destruction, but of their complete and utter annihilation. As I stepped out into the night air, the cool wind felt like a benediction. I felt the wetness on my sleeve, the heavy, lingering scent of the wine. It wasn't a stain. It was a memory. I walked to my car, got inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back at the lights of the Zenith Plaza. I didn't need to see the end. I knew exactly how it would play out. The police would arrive. The creditors would swarm. And for the first time in their lives, Veronica and Julian would know what it meant to have absolutely nothing. The disgraced soldier was leaving. And for the first time in 3 years, the war was truly over. The chaos in the ballroom had reached a fever pitch. The rhythmic ringing of phones had been replaced by the frantic dissonant babble of 1,000 people, realizing their fortunes were vaporizing in real time. The elite, those who had only minutes ago been preening and posturing, were now huddling in corners, staring at their devices with the pallor of the damned. In the center of this storm, Julian was a broken man, curled in a fetal position on the stage, weeping into the remnants of his broken dreams. Veronica stood motionless, a statue of grief and disbelief, her silver gown now a mockery of the status she had so desperately clawed for. I reached the center of the ballroom floor, the wine-stained sleeve of my jacket, heavy and cold against my arm. I was a solitary figure in the middle of a collapsing empire. The security guards, who had been ordered to evict me, now stood paralyzed, their eyes darting between me and the screens that displayed the systematic dismantling of the firm. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom groaned. They didn't just open. They were swung wide with a rhythmic military precision that silenced the room instantly.
The crowd parted.
It wasn't an act of courtesy, it was an act of instinct.
They sensed the shift in gravity, a change in the atmosphere so profound that even the most entitled among them felt the need to shrink away. A phalanx of men and women in charcoal gray suits entered. They moved like a single organism, 10 of the most powerful corporate executives in the industry, the shadow council that governed the global holding company I had built from the ashes of my early life. At their head was Sterling, the man who had overseen the Falcon Protocol. The ballroom fell into a silence so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Sterling and his team didn't look at the screens. They didn't look at the weeping Julian or the catatonic Veronica. They marched in a straight line, their boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed the heartbeat of an army. They walked directly toward me. As they reached the center of the room, 10 feet from where I stood, they stopped. In perfect unison, they turned toward me. The silence stretched, thinner and thinner, until it felt like a wire about to snap. Then, with the practiced fluidity of a well-oiled machine, they performed a move that defied everything the socialites in this room understood about power. They didn't shake hands. They didn't offer greetings. They bowed. It was a deep, formal, and utterly subservient gesture, a salute to a leader who had returned to his throne. "The audit is complete, sir," Sterling said, his voice ringing out across the ballroom, clear and devoid of any doubt. "All accounts have been secured. The holdings are fully under your direct control." The ballroom let out a collective gasp. Sterling pulled a slim black document case from his coat. He didn't hand it to Veronica. He didn't offer it to the board members who had been catering to Julian. He held it out to me. "The ownership transition is finalized," Sterling continued, his tone clinical. "The shell companies have been dissolved. The personal liabilities of the former stakeholders, Julian Vane and Veronica Thorne, are now legally tied to their personal assets, as per the clauses triggered this evening." I took the case, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at the crowd. The masks of mockery had been replaced by masks of sheer, unadulterated terror. They were finally beginning to comprehend. The pathetic soldier, the disgraced ex-husband, the trespasser, he was the man who had been signing their paychecks, funding their ventures, and pulling the strings of their reality from the shadows for years.
"Your identity, sir," Sterling added, turning to the crowd.
His voice was a cold indictment. "For those of you who have been speculating, let this be known. The chairman and sole proprietor of the Blackwood Holding Group has returned." He gestured to me, his hand open in a gesture of profound respect. "He is the architect of the very wealth you all fought so desperately to share tonight. He is the hand that held the power all along." The effect on the room was like a physical blow. I watched as the expressions of the city's elite shifted from arrogance to a nauseating, groveling desperation. Men who had mocked me 5 minutes ago were suddenly adjusting their ties, looking for a way to approach me, their eyes filled with a new, frantic desire to curry favor. I walked toward the stage, my footsteps sounding like the tolling of a bell. I didn't look at the men and women who were now frantically trying to pivot their allegiances. I walked straight to Veronica. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed, her face stripped of every trace of the poise she had worn like a mask for 3 years. I didn't know," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. I thought you were gone." "I thought I had to. You didn't have to do anything, Veronica. I interrupted. My voice wasn't raised. It was calm, detached, and utterly final. You chose to gamble on a fantasy, and you lost. You didn't lose because you lacked information. You lost because you lacked character. I turned to Julian, who was still trembling on the floor.
You wanted to know the price of status, Julian?
I asked. He didn't answer. He couldn't.
The price is everything, I said.
And you've just paid it in full. I looked out over the ballroom, at the faces of the people who had treated my daughter like a nuisance and me like a parasite. I had come here to reclaim what was mine, but as I stood there, surrounded by my loyal executives, I realized that I had already achieved something far greater. I had dismantled the illusion.
The gala is over, I announced.
My voice didn't need to be loud to command the attention of every person in the room. The contracts are void. The liability is reassigned. And as of this moment, every individual here who participated in the fraud initiated by the Vane and Thorn accounts is under legal review. My counsel will be in touch. The ballroom, once a place of celebration, was now a prison. The guests began to move, some towards the exits, some standing frozen, trapped by the weight of what I had just unleashed.
I didn't care about their departure.
I turned to Sterling. Take charge of the liquidation, I said.
I want the villa, the accounts, the cars, everything.
Everything they thought they owned is to be recovered. By tomorrow morning, I want them to have nothing. It will be done, sir. I turned away from the stage, from the broken ruins of the people who had once claimed to be my family. I walked toward the doors, my executive team forming a silent, protective wall around me. As I reached the threshold, I stopped. I looked back one last time at the ballroom, the glittering, artificial world that had tried to destroy me and my daughter. It was crumbling before my eyes, not because of a fire or a bomb, but because the truth had finally been spoken. The true owner had unmasked himself, not to claim the applause, but to end the show. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the cool, quiet night air. The city lights beckoned, but they no longer felt like a challenge. They felt like a landscape I had already mapped and conquered. I took out my phone. A text from a secure line appeared on the screen. Lily is safe.
She is waiting in the car.
The wine-stained jacket felt heavy, but it was a weight I was ready to shed. I had been a soldier, I had been a ghost, and I had been a pawn. But tonight, I was finally just a man. And for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly who that man was. The reckoning was complete. The past was burned away. And ahead of me, there was only the quiet, protected life I had fought to reclaim. I walked toward my car, leaving the wreckage behind, moving toward the only thing that had ever truly mattered, the warmth and the safety of my own blood. The gala was gone. The lies were dead. And the king, having revealed himself to a room full of cowards, was finally going home. The air in the grand ballroom had grown stagnant, thick with the scent of spilled wine, expensive perfume, and the overwhelming, metallic tang of fear. The elite, who only moments ago had been vying for a glimpse of the power couple, were now scrambling toward the exits like rats fleeing a sinking vessel. They knew that to be associated with Veronica and Julian in the next hour was to be branded with the same mark of financial leprosy that had just claimed the two of them. I stood at the center of the stage, the black tablet still in my hand. Beside me, Sterling and his team stood like a phalanx of silent, stone-faced guardians. The focus of the entire room was now fixed on the massive overhead screens, which displayed the finality of the collapse, Transragion terminated. All liabilities transferred to personal entities.
Asset seizure pending.
Veronica was still on the floor, her hands gripping the hem of her silver dress as if it were a life raft. She looked up at me, her face a chaotic map of denial, rage, and a terrifying dawning clarity.
You can't do this.
She shrieked, her voice scraping against the silence of the room.
The contract, the merger.
It's legal.
It's binding.
You can't just kill a billion-dollar deal with a swipe of a screen. I stepped down from the dais, my movements slow, measured, and terrifyingly calm. I stopped a few feet from her. I didn't look down at her with hatred. I looked at her with the clinical detachment one might afford a malfunctioning machine. A contract is only as binding as the good faith of the parties involved. Veronica, I said, my voice echoing throughout the hall. But there was no good faith here. There was only fraud, embezzlement, and a desperate, pathetic attempt to leverage a future that you never earned. I turned my gaze to Julian, who was still slumped on the floor, his face buried in his hands. Julian, I said, my voice cutting through his sobbing. You thought you were buying a legacy. You thought you were acquiring a crown, but you forgot the most basic rule of the game. You don't buy the crown, you earn it. I took the black tablet and tapped a final command, the kill switch. Across the room, the LED signage, the glowing brand name of their newly merged firm, the symbol of their supposed triumph, flickered and died. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, leaving only the cold blue glow of the screens. The merger is dissolved. I announced to the room at large, as of this second, the Blackwood Holding Group hereby terminates all interests in the Thorn Vein Partnership. All capital invested by our firm has been recalled. All outstanding loans, which were backed by the fraudulent assets you presented, are now due in full.
The finality of the statement hit the room like a physical shockwave.
That's impossible.
Veronica whispered, her breath hitching in her chest. That's over $800 million.
How can you? I don't how. I said, stepping closer until I towered over her.
I simply do.
The capital was never yours to begin with, Veronica.
It was mine. The leverage you used to build your empire was simply the rope I gave you to hang yourself. The realization finally shattered her. She didn't scream this time. She collapsed, her forehead hitting the floor, a sound so hollow and pathetic that it made the remaining guests wince. Her reputation, the polished icy veneer of the CEO, hadn't just been dented. It had been incinerated. Within the hour, every financial news outlet, every social media feed, and every boardroom in the city would be dissecting the fraud. Her name would become a cautionary tale whispered in business schools for decades to come. I looked at the crowd once more. They were silent, paralyzed by the spectacle of total destruction.
The gala is finished, I said.
Go home.
Call your own lawyers.
I suggest you ensure your own books are in order, because when my audit concludes, anyone who has facilitated this fraud will be held just as accountable as the two of them.
The exodus began immediately. It wasn't a graceful exit. It was a panicked, chaotic rush for the doors. They didn't want to be in the room when the legal teams arrived. They didn't want to be seen standing near the wreckage. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was nearly empty, leaving only the staff, the security detail, and the two broken people who had tried to build a throne on lies. I turned to Sterling.
Ensure the legal teams arrive within 15 minutes.
I want the injunction served before they can even leave the building. Understood, sir. Sterling replied, already signaling his team to move. I walked toward the exit, my heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the marble. I didn't look back at the stage. I didn't need to witness the police arrive. The collapse was already a certainty, a mathematical inevitability I had calculated years ago. As I pushed through the heavy doors and into the cool, crisp air of the evening, I felt the weight of the last 3 years finally falling away. The mud of the front lines, the cold of the rain-drenched porch, the suffocating secrecy, it was all gone.
My car was waiting at the curb.
The driver, a man I had trusted for a decade, opened the door for me. I slid into the back seat, the leather cool and smooth against my skin. I pulled out my phone and checked the private channel. A photo appeared, Lily tucked safely into her bed at our new secure residence, her face peaceful, untroubled by the storm that had just destroyed the people who abandoned her. I leaned back, closing my eyes. I had come home for her. I had fought to reclaim the world for her.
My phone vibrated.
It was a headline alert from the city's leading financial paper. Breaking Thorn Vein Partnership collapses under allegations of massive fraud. Assets frozen.
Bankruptcy imminent.
I watched the notification for a second, then swiped it away. It was a footnote in a story that was already over. The car moved silently away from the Zenith Plaza, merging into the stream of city traffic. I looked out at the lights of the skyline, the same lights that had once felt like the barriers of a prison. Now they were just lights. They were transient, flickering, and meaningless compared to the steady, calm rhythm of my daughter's breathing, which I could feel in the quiet space of my mind. I hadn't just terminated a contract. I had terminated an era of my life. I had burned the bridge, dismantled the trap, and left the parasites in the ashes. But as the car turned onto the quiet, tree-lined street that led to our new home, I realized something even more important. I hadn't lost my humanity in the process. I had protected it. I had been a force of nature, a cold instrument of justice. But I had done it all for the simple, unselfish act of love. I reached the gate of the estate. It was secure, private, and silent. As the gate swung open, I saw the house, a place of genuine warmth, not a stage for performance. I stepped out of the car. The night air was calm, smelling of jasmine and pine. There were no cameras here, no sycophants, no board members. I walked toward the front door, leaving the wreckage of the billion-dollar deal thousands of miles away in my mind. The mogul had done his work. The soldier had finished his mission. Now, there was only a father. I pushed the door open, the sound of a home, my home, welcoming me in. The game was over. The lie was dead. And for the first time in years, the future was finally blissfully quiet. The storm had passed. The news cycles had churned through the scandal, stripping the bones of the Thorn Vein Partnership for every scrap of salacious detail until there was nothing left to digest. The headlines had moved on to the next tragedy, the next triumph, The next fleeting distraction, the name Blackwood had retreated once more into the quiet annals of the private sector, shielded by non-disclosure agreements and the impenetrable wall of my executive council. For the world, the collapse of the billion-dollar deal was a seismic event. For me, it was merely the closing of a ledger. I sat on the deck of our new home, a secluded estate perched on a cliffside, overlooking the Pacific. The architecture here was humble, defined by warm cedar and glass, designed to invite the ocean breeze rather than block out the world. The only sound was the rhythmic, eternal percussion of the tide against the rocks below, a sound that, unlike the ticker tapes of the financial district, never demanded anything of me. Lily was playing in the sand on the private beach below, her laughter carried upward by the salt air like a kite caught in a gentle current. She was a different child now. The haunting, quiet apprehension that had defined her first weeks after my return had evaporated. She was vibrant, curious, and entirely free. I set my book aside and watched her. She was currently fascinated by a piece of driftwood, turning it over in her hands as if it were a lost artifact. She didn't know about the lawsuits, the frozen assets, or the catastrophic ruin of the people who had once claimed to be her parents. To her, the nightmare was a fading dream, replaced by the stability of a father who was always there, and a life that was finally, truly ours. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, worn photograph I had carried for 3 years. The edges were frayed, the image faded by the humidity of the jungle and the sweat of the front lines. I looked at it, then at the girl on the beach. The transition from that static, two-dimensional memory to this living, breathing reality was the only profit I cared to measure anymore. The screen door slid open behind me. Sterling stepped out, moving with his usual military-grade efficiency. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. "The final receivership documents have been signed, sir," he said, his voice low. "The estate in the city has been cleared. All legal encumbrances related to the Thorn and Vane entities have been settled in court. Their assets are fully liquidated and redirected into the trust fund we established for Lily." I didn't turn to look at him. I kept my gaze on the horizon, where the blue of the sky met the deeper blue of the sea.
And them?
"Where are they?" Sterling paused, a slight hesitation in his posture. "They aren't in the city anymore, sir. Julian Vane has been indicted on multiple counts of corporate fraud and embezzlement. He was apprehended at the border 3 days ago. As for Veronica Thorne,
She has moved to the interior?
she's living in a modest apartment in the outskirts, working as a junior clerk."
She has no access to the circles she once moved. She is effectively a ghost.
I nodded slowly. The ghost status was fitting. She had spent years trying to make me a ghost, trying to erase my existence to make room for her own ambitions. The irony was a bitter pill, but one I had no desire to swallow. It simply was. "Leave it there, Sterling," I said, my voice final. "No more surveillance, no more reports."
Let the world have its justice, and let me have my peace.
"Understood, sir." Sterling hesitated again. "The board is asking if you have a date for your return to the chairman's office." "The expansion in the Asian markets requires—" "Cancel the expansion," I interrupted. Sterling blinked, his stoic mask faltering for a fraction of a second. "Sir, the firm is stable," I said, finally turning to face him. "The systems I put in place are autonomous. You have the authority to manage the day-to-day."
"My tenure in the corporate world is finished."
"I am officially stepping down as CEO. The holding group will be governed by the council, with profits redirected to the philanthropic foundations we discussed." Sterling looked at me, searching for a sign that I was playing a game, that this was just another layer of a complex strategy.
He found none.
"You're serious," he said, more of an observation than a question. "I've spent the best years of my life building a machine to conquer a world I didn't even like," I said, leaning back in the chair. "I'm done conquering. I'm a father now. That is a full-time occupation." Sterling bowed his head, a genuine look of respect replacing the professional distance. "It has been the greatest honor of my career to serve you, sir. If you ever require anything I want," I said, a faint smile touching my lips.
Go home, Sterling.
"Take a vacation."
You've earned it.
He nodded, turned, and walked back into the house. I heard the faint click of the door, and then the silence returned, heavy, beautiful, and absolute. I stood up and walked down the path to the beach. The sand was cool beneath my bare feet. As I approached, Lily looked up, her face lighting up with that infectious, unburdened joy that still caught me off guard.
"Daddy!"
Look.
She held up the piece of driftwood.
It looks like a boat.
I knelt in the sand beside her, taking the wood from her hand. It was jagged and weathered, polished by the ocean into a rough, ship-like shape.
It does, I agree.
Where is it sailing to?
"To a place where it's always sunny," she said, her eyes bright with imagination. and where there are no monsters. I felt a sharp, sweet ache in my chest, the realization of how much she had understood and how much she had forgiven. I pulled her into my lap, hugging her tightly, feeling the solid, vibrant warmth of her against me.
That sounds like a good place to go, I whispered.
I think we're already there. We spent the afternoon on the beach, building sandcastles that the tide would eventually claim, a stark contrast to the fortresses of glass and ego I had spent my life constructing. These castles were temporary, fragile, and utterly inconsequential, and they were the most important things I had ever built. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet, the world seemed to slow down. I realized that the hidden mogul hadn't just defeated his enemies, he had defeated his own obsession. The need to control, the need to anticipate, the need to strike first. All of it had been a symptom of a life that lacked a core. Now I had a core. It was the weight of a 5-year-old girl leaning against my shoulder, the scent of the sea, and the promise of a night that wouldn't be interrupted by corporate crises or the whispers of betrayal.
Daddy?
Lily asked as we walked back up the path toward the house.
Yes, baby.
Are we going back to the big city ever? I looked at her, then back at the vast darkening ocean. I thought of the Zenith Plaza, the cold boardrooms, the people who traded their souls for a seat at a table that was about to collapse. I thought of the hunger I had once felt, the hunger for power, for recognition, for vengeance. It was gone, dissipated like the mist on the water. No, I said, my voice steady and certain.
We're staying right here.
We don't need that world anymore.
Good, she said, grabbing my hand.
I like it better when it's just us. We reached the house and I opened the door. The interior was glowing with the soft, warm light of the evening. It was quiet. It was safe. It was ours. I closed the door behind us, sealing out the past, the industry, the greed, and the noise. I locked the deadbolt not to keep people out, but to lock the peace in. The dust had settled. The ledger was closed. The soldier was home, and the mogul was dead. And in the quiet hum of a house filled with the sounds of a normal, beautiful life, I finally felt the absolute, crushing, wonderful weight of being free. There was no next chapter to write, no new deal to negotiate, no enemy to dismantle. There was only the present, and for the first time in my life, the present was enough. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of dinner beginning to drift through the house. I sat at the table and watched my daughter set the plates. The future stretched out before us, an infinite, uncharted horizon of simple, quiet, reclaimed days. I was no longer the architect of ruin. I was the keeper of the hearth. And as I watched Lily laugh at a stray cat wandering past the window, I knew that I had won the only war that had ever truly mattered. I had reclaimed my life, and I would never let it go.